talk to me about a little bit where you grew up and where
Okay,
you were.
I was born in Illinois, just north of St. Louis, just a steamboat whistle north of St. Louis, where the Missouri intersects with the Mississippi.
Ec-
A little town called Alton, A-L-T-O-N,
Okay.
Alton, Illinois. And I was born there in 26. My parents had both been born there. 3 of the 4 grandparents had been born there. So we go back to 1829. That's as far back as our particular family goes.
How far from Carbondale was that?
About 120 miles.
Okay. Trying to get an idea where you were.
Yeah, we were west of that, right on the Mississippi. And we grew up there in Alton. I grew up there until I was 14. Then I went away to school until I was 19. And I left the school at 19 and went into the Army directly. I was in the Army 3 weeks after I left school in October of 45. And of course I was a late comer and a foot dragger and all that kind of thing. But I served then until 47. And I was discharged in 47. So that was my whole entire service period. In a small town like that, you knew everybody. The town is still the same size it was then. I still have many relatives there, including two brothers still live there, and many others, cousins, nephews, even 2 of my dad's, well, 1 of my dad's brothers lives there. So it's the home place. And my daughter Trace found a picture that was made in 1908 of Alton. We plan to use it as a Christmas gift this year. So, but it was one
Quite
of
a bit
those,
different than Westmead, isn't it?
yeah, it was panoramic that they had taken from the top of the railroad bridge on the middle of the Mississippi. They have the whole entire area. You look north and you're looking up to Chicago. You look south and you're looking at New Orleans. And you're right on that, right at the intersection of the Missouri, the Illinois, and the Mississippi.
Sounds like a great town.
It was, it really was. We grew up very close to the vest because of the Depression. My father was a steel worker, and then he became one of the first welders and ended up as a, can't think of the name, metallurgic engineer. And after World War II, he did a lot of work training people in metallurgy. He was responsible for some rather prominent restorations for the World's Fair in 1960 and so forth. He restored the old Civil War locomotive that they had no parts for. He made them and all. So that was his job. My mother was always a homemaker, but she also had a job taking care of an insurance agency in the front room all during that time. But at that time, my parents paid $3,500 for a home that housed 6 children. And my dad built bedrooms as fast as we had children. And they both worked both jobs all that time. And everybody was graduated from the same grade school. My older sister was graduated from a high school there, but we moved in 1942 to Louisville. And we lived in Louisville from 1942, and we just sold the family home last year. So we'd been there 60 years. The family had been there 60 years. We sold it to one of my nephews, so it's still in the family.
Oh, wow.
But in any case, Louisville was the next stage, and that happened while I was away at school. And I'd come home for a summer vacation during that time. And then when I went into the Army, I went from Louisville. I was in the Louisville draft. Well, I wasn't drafted, actually. I joined a regular Army. And we had an 18-month term. And I served all 18 months, of course, during that period. I was shipped to Camp Atterbury, spent 3 weeks there, and was transshipped over to Camp Roberts in California, trained as an infantryman, shipped from there to Camp Kilmer, shipped out for Germany in early 1946. We were shipped to Le Havre, Lucky Strike, Camp Lucky Strike, trained from there by train through Mainz into Frankfurt, and then to Erlanger, which was our reputable. And I was there about 3 weeks, and then was assigned to the War Crimes Trials Unit, 7708 War Crimes Group. And we were part of USAFE, had the same left shoulder patch as Eisenhower. And we had the right shoulder patch for Patton because their group maintained our work. We were part of the JAG and answered through lines to JAG for what we did. Of course, Robert Jackson was the guy who originally formed this up with President Roosevelt. And they actually did it in 44, and then Jackson built it, and then they put Biddle on the judge's staff. And Biddle was an old politician, thought he should be the chief judge. And when they named an Englishman as a chief judge instead of him, he became very bitter and did everything he could to destroy Jackson and a lot of that work. All that's documented very well. There are many books written about Biddle and that time. Probably the most realistic and believable book that I've read about our unit was written by a doctor from Louisville. He just died last year, and he lived in St. Matthews area of Louisville and wrote a book late in life about what had happened. And he debunked a lot of theories, including the theory about Tex Richard, the guy who was put in jail for giving Goering his capsule. And doctor proved that Goering had hidden it in a jar of cold cream from the time he was captured until the time he used it. And he used Tex to go upstairs to his trunk and get this jar of cold cream. Tex didn't know what he was doing. He was a captain in the unit that guarded the prisoners. So that's just one incident that he wrote, but it's by far the best presentation I've read. We went to the trials, of course, and my job was to maintain all of the files that we had available to the attorneys at whatever trial was held. Now, unfortunately, everybody thinks about the Nuremberg war crimes trials as being centered in Nuremberg, and that's not true at all. That was a show place, and they did use it as a show place. Probably 50 times as many trials, or people at least, were tried in other areas, like the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, wherever. And we had to provide the material and documentary evidence for those trials. My job was to be in charge of the unit that maintained those files in the vaults of a German bank, starting in Wiesbaden. And then in August of 1946, we moved all of those files to Augsburg, excuse me, and put them in a caserne, which I visited twice in 1990, 1991, 1998. Still there. They've built a roller rink in the same area where we used to sleep, but it's still there, still like it was. After we moved there, I was made special service officer, reporting to a full-bird colonel. We had very few officers in our unit, only 85 enlisted men at peak, but we had WACs, about 60 WACs with our unit. We had an English contingent, a French contingent, and a Russian contingent. And I won't even say who caused me the biggest problems, but you probably know. One of my jobs was to hand out all of the quotas for the tours of ETO from that point on. And each week I had to find out how much space we had available for those tours and then assign who was going on the tours. And I did that until I left that area. But of course I had to lead a lot of these tours because I could speak just enough German to get by, having been brought up in a home where German was spoken as a second language. My grandparents spoke both English and German very fluently. My great-grandmother never learned English, so you know.
Was your family living in Germany at the time of the war?
No.
Grandparents or anybody?
No. My great-grandmother's sister and some other relatives were apparently still alive in Magdeburg. That's where they had come from. And ancestors of my grandmother had been born in Kassel, and they still lived there apparently at the time. But we had no contacts, none whatsoever. We've all tried. My brother lived in Austria for 6 years in the 60s, and he tried every way he could to get genealogical information and got nothing. The theory of it is that my grandfather, who was too young to know what was going on, was the son of a German officer in the War of 1870. And apparently his unit was not well thought of, and the family suffered when that happened. So his aunt brought him to this country to start fresh. He came as a glassblower. He was an apprentice, became a master glassblower just months before they put in new machinery to do all the glass blowing for him for Owens Illinois Glass. And then he went to driving a beer truck for a while, and then he did about he had a grocery store, and the Mississippi flooded him out of that, and he went to work in his last years in his 70s as a janitor in the high school where all of his children went to school.
Wow.
I worked with him from the time I was 8 years old until I left at 14. I helped him every Saturday. We became very close, so I learned a lot of German.
I bet.
But there are many words I don't want to repeat. Okay?
I know Danke and Bitte, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Going back to when you were drafted, correct?
Right.
You were 18? 17?
19.
19.
I was 19.
Okay. What did you know was happening overseas at this time?
Not much.
You knew there was a war.
Yes.
You knew maybe there were some POWs. Did you even know that?
We knew it indirectly.
Right.
I should explain that I was in a Catholic preparatory seminary to become a priest.
Oh, okay.
And I entered there straight from 8th grade.
Right.
When war broke out, 1941,
Right.
I had been there 2 years. And what we got in the way of news was what our superiors cut out of the paper and put on the board. We didn't have newspapers there. And we lived there every day but one on the Sunday after Christmas when we got to go home for one day.
Did you know that there was an attack or there was a war on the Jews?
Oh yes,
You-
oh yes,
you knew
oh yes,
that.
yes.
You
I
knew
got
Jews
most
were
of
being
that.
persecuted and killed.
Yes, we got a lot of information from the Catholic periodicals, and there were many, many, many articles about that.
What was your understanding that the Catholic, now you're aware of the Catholic position back then as opposed to how they are now. Did you feel that there was any separation at the time? Did you feel that the Catholics were, the information that was coming to you was from, coming from the Vatican?
Hierarchy?
Yeah.
No.
No.
To give you an example, the Trapp family visited us and performed on our stage in the seminary. They had their chaplain with them. They also had a couple of DPs with them traveling. And they explained to us exactly what the situation was that caused them to leave Austria. Maria von Trapp and her daughters and son, well, not her oldest daughter. They didn't bring their oldest daughter to the seminary. They left her at home that day. I wonder why. Anyway, make a long story short, we learned from that kind of source as well as from periodicals what was going on. And I think we had a pretty fair spread of information. Some of it was sparse.
Right.
Some of it was simple propaganda, and others of it was, I think, pretty sound.
This was about what year? Do you remember?
It had to be after 1942, but before 1944.
So the camps were well underway, the death camps
Oh,
not
yes,
yet.
oh,
Right.
yes, yes. Now, the Trapps did not address that issue at all. Neither did the chaplain. However, several of the DPs who were there with them did talk about some of the problems that were facing the people. They didn't differentiate by group, but they said that good Germans are being put to death in gas chambers.
And they were referring to the Jews.
Yep.
What year were you drafted?
I was never drafted. I joined up
Oh,
when
you
I
did
left
join.
school. Yeah,
Okay.
I left voluntarily because I hit the 6th year, which is the deciding year.
Right.
And I decided that that wasn't for me, with the help of many good people. And within 2 weeks after I left, I was in the Army. I just went to the nearest sign-up station and joined the regular Army, and signed up at that time for 18 months that could be extended if they needed you. But as it turned out, I'd served just 18 months.
And this was what year?
45, excuse me.
1945.
In October of 1945, I joined, and I was out in March of 1947.
1945, by then the camps had been liberated.
Oh, yes, yes.
Had you heard about what was going on?
Oh, yes, yes, it was an explosion.
It was, okay.
Yeah.
So when you went over there, were you aware of what your duties were going to be?
No,
No. You went over there,
I went over as
worked the
a
war trial.
replacement. No, they didn't assign me to the war crimes trials until I got to Erlanger.
Okay.
And they were forming up the unit and fulfilling all the slots.
And you were at Goring's trial?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, we attended the trials relatively frequently.
Tell me about that.
Well, you had to get on the travel list, and that wasn't too hard for somebody who was in charge of the quotas. But we carried the film in for the engineers who were stationed with us, and we were admitted because of our jobs, and we tried to stay up in the balcony, but some of our people were used as runners or couriers or some other duties. I would say that in my judgment, we did not understand much of what was going on. They had the IBM phones, and you could get the interpretations, the translations, but so much of it was so arcane that it didn't mean much to us. Now, certain trials were more spectacular than others. We were very limited in what we could do. We were not allowed just to go and come. When we got to the trials, we were stripped of cameras and any other, of course, our weapons were all taken. We were admitted like any other visitors were. Just because we had the uniform on didn't mean much to the MPs. We got to know some of them. One of the fellows who was in the MP unit married a German girl who was Walter Cronkite's secretary.
Oh, wow.
She had been born in New York, and her family moved back to Germany. And one of the fellows came back home and then left from Murfreesboro. He lived in Murfreesboro. And he went back and married her overseas and brought her here, and my son married her daughter.
Oh, my.
How about that for a coincidence?
Wow. That is a
So he
coincidence.
lives here in Brentwood still. Carl Puckett is his name, and he was one of the MPs in the unit. He could tell you all about all the correspondence because his job was to drive the correspondence to and from their billet to the trials every day. And his wife worked for Walter Cronkite, so he picked her up on the way.
That's
And this
great.
is 52 years later.
Oh, wow.
So,
What did you know? How did you feel at the time? I mean, I know you weren't Jewish.
no.
How did you feel at the time being among Goring, who's considered one of the great masterminds of all time, with
Yeah.
evil?
Yeah.
How
Well,
did you feel?
it's a very difficult thing to talk about because most of the people that I knew who attended those trials felt that Goering was about the only articulate man in the dock. They had no respect at all for Hess or for most of the rest of the defendants, but they felt that Goering was at least organized and articulate. And for that,
Organized how, would you say?
well, in the sense that he followed a line of defense or a line of opposition, perhaps. When he spoke, people listened. When the others spoke, people laughed, made fun of them, called them names. And there were certain people who thought that people like von Papen should have been acquitted and was. There were people who defended certain other people in the docks. Jodl, for instance, Keitel was one of the favorites of them. I say favorites in the sense that they were open to them, but they had little respect for the large group. But you could almost feel a certain tenseness when Goering was speaking or called. you could feel a certain kind of respect for what he said because it was meaningful. It was not what we wanted to hear, and we didn't accept it, but we did listen. So I would say that our response at that point depended on who was talking. We had little respect in our unit for Judge Biddle because of all the complications which had filtered down to us from the upper groups.
What did Gehring say? What do you remember him saying?
What
Was
I
he
remember
denying
him
what
saying, oh no, I don't think he could have denied. He wouldn't have been meaningful if he had, in my opinion. But what I remember him saying is that I held high office. I was responsible for many people. And I did what I thought was good for the German people, just as your president would do for your people.
How'd you feel about that?
We felt that he was making too good a case, I think. We didn't expect him to make a good case. We thought he was a fat, old, bloated vestige group. When he was arrested, he was given no respect. And the people who did arrest him were close by, still there, serving. Our apprehension unit was involved in some of the transportation of those prisoners and really gave them no respect. The people who guarded them had very little respect for them, but they were very closely controlled. We were all very closely controlled by our officers. As I said before, we had very few officers in our unit. Colonel Strait was our number one man. He was a full bird. Colonel Eichmann was the man I responded to, and his name was really Eichmann, just like the accused. Both of them were old regular Army colonels, had been there for all of their lives. And we paid a lot of attention to what they thought. And what they said to us is, it's not your job to make these judgments. It's your job to provide the information, the support, and the help to these people. We would import a new lawyer, for instance, for a given case, like the Malmedy cases, as a good example. They would ship in 2 or 3 lawyers, make them majors on the spot. They were civilian lawyers. Make them majors. We had to billet them, put them up, get the information to them, provide the records for them, and see that they were properly supported. And as soon as the trials were over, they went back home. And so it was a very changeable unit. The presence of the English and the French was welcome to us. Some of the other presences were not welcome to us. I would say our work that we did in the offices was very mundane. One of our fellows, in fact, said his entire duties was to sit at a typewriter and type items which people brought to him on this side of the day, and when he finished, they put them on this side. So there was that kind of duty. And then there were other people that went out and arrested the suspects or the witnesses. I did not personally arrest anybody. I went with a couple of the groups. I was sergeant of the guard several times and had to disarm a prisoner on one night, which was the most violent action I saw. I was shot at by the German police on my way to Mass one day, believe it or not, quite accidentally. They were chasing a blackmailer up the street, and I happened to be in the middle of the street. And that's as close as I came to violent action.
Let me back up to Gehring.
Okay.
You mentioned that he had commanded a level of respect because of his articulacy and his ability to make a case.
That's right.
How do you feel about what he did?
Oh, I feel it's criminal in every way. I feel that he lost it well at the beginning before we even got involved in the war. I feel that he was very selfish, very grasping. I mean, he was obviously a bandit. But we didn't know at that time what all he had done. It was only becoming obvious then.
Coming out in the trial?
That's right. Well, and then the Stars and Stripes would have these printouts of discoveries of these caches here and there, and the some of our own soldiers who took advantage of that and looted some of those castles. Those were in the Stars and Stripes when I was there. And we were all cautioned. I was cautioned on one occasion for giving a used army blanket to a German civilian who had no army blankets. He worked in the dark room, helped me every day. And I gave him a used army blanket, and I was threatened with being sent home because I gave him a used army blanket. So that was our attitude at that time. It was very,
Do your job and go home.
yeah, it was very realistic in that sense. And most of the fellows were ready to go home when their time came. I didn't know anybody who signed up for further duty.
What do you remember most about the trial?
It's hard to say. I think the security impressed me, number one. I had never been in a situation where that much security was present. There was a sense of dignity, a sense of quiet. It was an extremely quiet place. A sense that people were paying attention to what was going on, but there were certain areas and certain times when that just disintegrated and people would get up and leave and come back. And
Do you feel that he was represented properly and given a fair trial?
Oh, no question, no question. You look at the verdicts and you can see right down the line that they followed the highest possible motivations.
Had you been to any of the camps or seen any of the survivors while you were there?
Oh, yes. We had many DPs working for us in the unit, and we learned a lot from them.
Was that difficult for them to be around Goering? Do you recall?
As far as I know, no DPs were ever allowed at the trials. We did not schedule any DPs for our tours or for, well, I take that back. They were able to go on Hitler's yacht on the Rhine when they requested it and there was room. But that's the only place they were ever allowed to go outside their jobs. We were scared of the Poles because the Polish people had suffered the most in everybody's opinion, and it was very difficult to live with them. They were very violent people.
The Polish people?
Yes.
Violent how?
Well, when we used them as guards, we took away their weapons under any conditions and gave them one cartridge most of the time and told them to shoot it in the air to alert us. That was our instructions.
Did you understand their desire to?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. No question about it. One of the people that I traveled with, for whom I have great respect, Fretwell Kreider, who is living in Savannah now, Fretwell said at one point, I'd hate to be a German by myself with any one of those Polish people. I remember him vividly saying that to me, and I asked him why. He was a little older than the rest of us. He's still alive, by the way, and a good friend. But he said they suffered so much that all they can remember is what they suffered. Most of them had no families left, none whatsoever. And that was one thing that kept coming forward every time we were with them or around them. We had a feeling of fear, of violence.
In Dachau, there's a story that circulates, and I can't think of the name of the book, but it's 3 liberators, 18, 19 years old, who had turned over their weapons to a couple inmates and allowed them to shoot at the Nazis.
Yes.
They were interviewed. I don't remember the consequences of their actions, but they were huge. But they all 3 had stood by saying that it was imperative that they gave these inmates an ability to get some dignity back and some form of retaliation, primarily because they were too thin and sick to physically fight back. Some of them did physically take punches at the Nazis, and I understood the liberators to have held them down. But at 60, 70 pounds, they can't be very effective.
Right.
Did you hear stories like that? Had you heard circulated stories of liberators assisting inmates in getting back at Nazis before the trials?
Yes, we heard those stories. We didn't know anything about them. We couldn't document them. Now, I believe Jim Doris implicitly. And Jim was one of the ones who stopped people doing that.
He was, you're
Yep,
right.
yep. And I would have supported Jim in that position.
Ironically, the difficult position is you can understand why they wanted to.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
can understand the liberators that wanted to let them get their, but you can also
question.
understand the need to stop it.
Absolutely.
So that's a very
Absolutely.
interesting
Yes,
position to be
yes,
in.
yes. Yes, I have friends who were survivors of several camps, and I have heard some things from them that I trust implicitly because they're high type people, wonderful people, the Gross brothers I mentioned. Yes, Carl and Ben both, I would trust implicitly when they said something to me, and they told me some few very sparse reminiscences. My feeling about it is that they, of course, they were younger than we were. They were in their teens at that time. They had been in those camps for some time, well, 6 or 7 years. They were in Theresienstadt, I remember that, and I think Buchenwald and Dachau. They were actually, as I believe, Carl was in 6 and Ben was in 5, as I remember. But that's been a long time since I've gone over that, so that's not trustworthy. I have to talk to them
That's
about
okay.
that. Yeah.
Where was I headed with that? I started on something.
Talking about survivors.
Right. What do you say to people, and they exist, I'm sure you've heard, let's say it never happened.
It's ridiculous.
What do you say? You didn't see it. You heard, these are the trials, you saw some of the DPs. It's so outrageous.
Oh,
it's so completely outrageous to think that people can be responsible for the death of 10 million people, 6 million being Jews. What do you say?
Well, one of the things that I have said is that I talked to the German people, not many, but some. I used to buy pastry in Dachau when I went there because they had great pastry, and I've got a picture somewhere of the pastry. But anyway, what I said on a couple of occasions was the Germans never denied it. The people who lived in it never denied it. Their excuses were, I was only following orders. I was helpless. I couldn't do anything about it. Nobody ever said it
These were the
didn't.
people, the residents.
We couldn't tell one Nazi
Right.
from someone who wasn't a Nazi, so we didn't know.
Right.
But the people that I dealt with, including the young man that I worked with in the darkroom who had lived through that era, was about a year younger than I, said that as far as they were concerned, it was a given, that it was a fact. And the fact that Dachau had been opened as early as it had in the 30s, and that they had had people there imprisoned without cause for many, 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 many years, simply verified the fact that they were there because of their race, because of their religion, because of their practices. And I'm talking about what the Germans said now, not what the Americans were saying. I didn't have many contacts, but I had some. Of course, back then you didn't tell who you had either. You know, that was another whole side of it. But I would say that we trusted the German people, whether they were Nazis or not, we didn't always know. But I'd say we trusted what they told us, and they never denied it. And to my way of thinking, that's pretty much a given.
Now, you are German.
Yes. Well, I'm third generation.
Right.
Yes.
Got German in your blood.
Yeah, with a name like mine. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
Weiss.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not German, but
No,
it is a German name.
Yeah.
Do you, how do you feel about that? These are your people
Yes.
that did this.
Well, they were close to us in appearance and in habits, a lot of them. I could identify some of my great-grandmother's habits with people that I met overseas. I tried to differentiate language, for instance. I tried to learn High German and Low German. I tried to become part of that community so that I could learn more about them. But it wasn't easy, and I don't consider them benefiting from what we have as American citizens
You've been back to Germany.
several times.
Is it difficult for you? I know, I'll be honest with you, when I was in Germany, it was very difficult for me to look at elderly people, older people,
Oh,
in
yeah,
the 50s
yeah.
and older, because they were there.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Do you have any sense of,
When I went back in '91, I had only sparse contact with them. I really can't say I had any reaction at that point because I was so intent on finding the places where we had served. And I really didn't develop much, but on the train, I took the overnight train from Munich to Brussels and stopped at Wiesbaden on the way. I spent a night at Wiesbaden, came into Mons and took the flyer up. And on the train between Mons, when I reboarded the next morning in Brussels, I had been traveling in a private compartment and I moved out into the other compartment so I could talk with the other people. And there was quite a different group there, a disparate group. There were a couple of American people. There were several people who were upset about the fact that so many of the East Germans were a drag on the West German economy and blamed the fact of the division of Germany on the war and the people who had caused that. I would say that what I learned from that was that these people were thinking about the same kinds of thing we thought here in this country. As we look at the illegal immigrants, for instance, they looked at the East Germans who were coming in and using their funds. So my feeling about it is that they were not far from us, but they had been so misled that they had no concept of reality. And I've learned this too from other people since who've come from the same genre. And I think a lot of the good people who wanted to do something to stop the terrible atrocities were so scared and so intimidated
right?
that there can be some understanding of their feelings. Of course, for people who've lost their whole families, Carl Gross has an office with pictures of his families on every wall, completely covered with families. For a man like that to live in that circumstance every day must be a torture. And I've never had that kind of experience.
There are survivors who say they felt more betrayed by the Germans, the non-Nazis, the neighbors,
Yeah.
the shopkeepers, the doctors,
Yeah.
the teachers,
I've heard that. Yeah,
than the Nazis.
Yeah.
Nazis being Nazi by definition a monster.
yeah.
These were
Yeah.
your former countrymen in a lot of ways.
That's right. That's right.
How does
Yeah.
that feel?
Well, it doesn't feel good, and you wonder whether we could be guilty of the same lack of strength, lack of
Do you
resistance.
think they didn't help them because they were afraid, or do you think that there was really something else?
Well, I would say by far the greatest feeling was the one of intimidation, of being afraid. For instance, I knew that the practice of the Germans was to not just punish the person who did something, but to punish his entire family. And I learned that before I ever got in the Army. I learned that that was a characteristic of the Germans. And I always felt that that was a terrible, terrible problem. Whether or not they were intimidated to the point of complete helplessness is something else. You know, we keep hearing about these plots to assassinate Hitler that didn't work. You wonder how much of that was really supported by the populace. And I doubt very much of it was, frankly.
What do you want people to know about what happened as a liberator?
Well, I think they should know how unnatural, unhuman, inhuman it was. I think they should study it well enough to realize that anybody is capable of that if they're pushed to that point. And I don't mean to say that being pushed to that point is an outside influence. I mean if they're pushed to that point by their insides as much as by the outside environment. We're all capable of the worst kinds of problems, I believe. And if we ever get in that situation, I pray to God that we'll have people who will stand up and resist it. But, you know, the old saying is that I didn't fight it because it didn't affect me, and then it affected my neighbor, and it didn't affect me, and pretty soon there was nobody left to defend me. And I think we need to learn that as a people, as a group, as well as individuals. And I'm not at all sure that we're learning it. Not at all sure we are. I see too much selfishness, too much self-serving, and that kind of thing to be happy with that kind of understanding. And I don't mean to be devout or
No,
pious about that.
no,
I just
that's
feel
not
like that's a terrible danger for
Say
our
that people
children.
don't learn the history or doomed to repeat it. Do you believe that?
Exactly, absolutely, yeah. And I worry about our grandkids and theirs. You know, it's cyclical in a sense, but you would hope that we would learn to moderate those cycles to a point where reason could take over under any circumstance. And that didn't happen in their case. And if you read the time from 1919 to 1934, all of those functions were involved. Selfishness, and grasping, and terrible hate, and deprivation, and all of those things were part of that pattern. And it created a kind of thing which we don't even want to look at today. We deny sometimes, or some people deny. But I don't have any patience. You ask how I feel about the people who would deny it. I can't have any respect for anybody who would deny that. That makes no sense. And it seems to me that the admission of the German civilians that it did happen is final proof. And to my way of thinking, that's been the case since they were made to walk through the concentration camps by Eisenhower and people like that. And they were actually made to handle the results of those atrocities. And I applaud that kind of reaction that happened.
It's been said that several times, you'll see it everywhere, FDR called himself a friend of the Jews.
Oh yeah.
You're aware, maybe you're not aware, that several Jews, primarily survivors, do not find him more of a foe of the Jews.
I'm quite aware of it. And they
The
feel the same way
military-
about Pope Pius XII.
Right.
Same thing.
The military
Yep.
did not step in sooner. The
Right.
military did not bomb the railroad to Auschwitz, which
Right,
is what
right.
the Jewish Defense League was begging Roosevelt to do.
Right.
As a military person,
Yes.
how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it was a mistake. I think it should have been done. We had the forces in
I know, somebody's knocking.
There's
Want me to go
nothing now.
back?
No, it's okay. Let's just kind of go through that again. Just
I,
because
I always find it fascinating what veterans feel about it, because as
Yeah.
a civilian,
Yeah.
Roosevelt said could have been too much collateral damage. Civilians could have been killed in the attempt. How do you feel about that?
I don't buy it. I wouldn't buy it today if I were in the staff and talking about it. I would say collateral damage is to be expected, and this is not collateral damage that we can't support. We're doing something far more worthy of the job. I think it would have been only partially effective because the Germans were killing people everywhere. They weren't just killing them in the camps. We had many files where flyers shot down were immediately lynched by the local peasantry without even a soldier present, or even the mayor sometimes. And we documented cases like that. I guess I saw at least a dozen or more of those cases. And they were prosecuted too. We prosecuted whole numbers of people who were, we had pictures of them participating in some lynches that happened. Those were part of our
You feel
evidence.
good about your service there? You feel good about your time spent?
Yes, I felt that I was very fortunate to be in that position. I was never shot at and I feel a little bit of regret that I couldn't do more, but that was my job. I did my job and did it well. My feeling about it is that we're all subject to service, and that was my service. I would have been happy to serve any way they told me to do. But my feeling about it now is that it was the best part of my life. in the sense of personal
Purpose.
right? You have one ambition when you get up in the morning, and that is do your duty. And you do it, and that's the end of the day. And you don't stop and wonder, did I do it right? It's part of what's being done. I regret the fact that I didn't learn more over there. I had some opportunities, more than most did. I had 2 years of college before I went, or junior college. First 2 years, year and a half of college. So I had some background, and that served me well. So I was able to participate in a lot of things I would not have had that opportunity for before.
Do you have a sense of understanding that you served and were a, however indirect participant of the trial
Yes.
of what's considered the greatest, in a sense, of most horrific acts of murder
Yeah.
in the history of mankind?
But
Do
you
you
know
have
what
a
bugged me
sense of-
about that? Even then, there was talk about, are we trying these people because we were the victors rather than because they did something wrong? Now, I'm talking about back then. Now, most of this was enlisted men's club talk or discussion after a round of golf. We played golf over there a couple times, several times, a number of times, they tell me. But we had occasions where we sat down and talked seriously about this with people whom I just saw a month ago. And their feeling about it then was about what it is now. You know, that yes, it was justified. Yes, it was necessary. And if we went through the same thing again, it would be necessary to do it again.
What was justified and necessary?
The creation of the war crimes trials
Right,
system and the punishment that ensued. There's a feeling that it's so difficult to prove it or to get down to the facts that almost nobody has the resources or will appropriate the resources to do anything
That
about
was
it.
the feeling among the soldiers?
Well, there were some feelings that way. Then there
Right.
were other feelings that were more black and white, I'd say.
Because you had talked to DPs.
Oh,
You
yes.
So you had heard.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
First-hand accounts of what
We
was
worked with
happening.
DPs. I had one just 10 feet from my desk, and he had been through the entire war as a DP. His family had been destroyed in Krakow, and he had been all over Europe and in labor gangs and that kind of thing. He was never in a camp, but he was homeless for the entire time, 5 years.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I have to say, and I know it sounds crazy, but I honestly have to say 50 years later that I enjoyed my service and the opportunities that it gave me to get some feeling for other people and other people's lives and other places. You didn't ask me, but I have to say I believe in universal service for that purpose. I believe it's the best education in the world. I believe it's the best kind of association because you meet all different kinds of people. And some become fast friends. Some you never hear of again. Some you learn to detest. And my feeling is that's growing up. I had an opportunity to grow up when I was very young, and to my way of thinking, it's a great advantage. And if anybody asked me today, I'd probably want to put in universal service for that reason now, not for the
Duly noted.
war reasons, but they could build roads or help people that need help. But I really do feel that it was an educational experience which I could not have bought for $1 million a day. And it's lasted me all my life. And I still have good friends, ones I was with last month right here in Nashville. We still celebrate together, and I talk to them on the phone. When the fires happened out there, we were on the phone and find out what happened to the guys who live out there on the fires, you know. And that's 60 years ago now. So those things last. You get to know these people pretty well.
Well, this has been an honor
Well, thank you.
to share
Thank
this
you.
with you.
I'm delighted to have
We
the
are
opportunity.
delighted that you came out.
Well, good, good. I'm sorry I don't meet your qualifications for survivor or
No.
liberator.
No, you absolutely, you do meet our qualifications for
Do I?
liberator.
Okay.
Absolutely,
You were part of the trials. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
key.
Yeah, yeah,
What we have found in doing this project is that we have so many different people, from survivors to liberators. Some were combat troopers coming in on the first day, and some were flying in 30 days later. It's for the sake of just projects in general, there's always boundaries that we set.
sure.
But the war crime trials are key,
Yeah,
Pivotal in the
Yeah.
war.
Like, in a way, you have a perspective that is different from any liberator, because a lot of the liberators, they had the perspective of it was just their work. It was one day they were in. They almost didn't. It was so quick.
They
and
were
so
there like
sudden.
hours.
Shock.
yeah, yeah.
Whereas you have a perspective of a sort of a holistic view of
Yeah.
the experience, and getting real, interaction with people on all different sides of it.
You know, the most emotional time I had was when I had to spend an overnight in the guard shack at Dachau. I have a picture of that building here. I think you saw it. It's right above the entrance where they say, work makes you free. Right above that was a little room. And we bunked out down there. And in the middle of the night, I can remember thinking, what if I was an inmate here? You know, and I remember it to this day. And of course, I never was an inmate. I didn't suffer that way, but it made an impression. It was pretty dire. Yeah,
A lot of ghosts in that guard shack.
Not many people get to have that
yeah,
impression.
yeah, yeah,
That's a
yeah.
perspective.
It's really unfortunate that they've papered that all over, in my opinion. I think that was a disservice to history.
When you say papered, what do you mean?
Well, they've closed it off. They have fences on the drainage ditch. You
Okay.
can't get there unless you know where you're going, and not many people know what's over there. And it's so covered with trees and bushes that you have to part them to even get to what is left. And when I went in 91, I was astonished, really astonished, because if you talk to my friends, you'll hear that was one of the first impressions I had. My God, they've erased it. And they they took the headquarters building and made a museum. Some of the statements on that museum wall are not statements I would make, I promise you. Some of them simply talk about political fights when they should be talking about human fights, And I mean that, I don't mean to be cryptic. I mean,
No, I see what you're saying.
it was difference. I still have some pictures of those displays. I was so surprised to see them written up as they were, and that map that has all of those concentration camps on it that I showed you in that book. I thought there were maybe, from my experience, 24 concentration camps. There were well over 100, and they were everywhere. And for anybody to say they didn't know they existed is pretty unbelievable.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
Yep. Thank you.
thank you, sir.
Thank you, Don.
It's been an
Be
honor.
happy to. Well, I appreciate it.